Colonel David Roth stepped out of the black diplomatic car onto the cobblestones of Wellington Barracks, his polished boots clicking against the ancient stones. The morning fog hung thick over London, creating an almost mystical atmosphere around the red brick buildings that housed the Queen's Guard, as the newly appointed Israeli military liaison to British forces. David carried himself with the confident swagger of a man who had spent 20 years commanding elite units in the Israel Defense Forces. The British had requested his expertise in urban warfare tactics, and David was eager to share his knowledge. However, what he didn't anticipate was the culture shock that awaited him. Coming from a military where efficiency and results mattered more than ceremony, David found himself in a world where tradition ruled supreme. Captain James Whitmore of the Coldstream Guards approached him with measured steps. His red tunic was immaculate, every button gleaming, and his bearskin hat added an imposing height to his already tall frame. The contrast between the two officers was striking. David in his practical olive green uniform and James in his ceremonial splendor. Colonel Roth. "Welcome to Wellington Barracks," James said, with a crisp British accent, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of military tradition. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" David nodded, but his eyes were already scanning the parade ground where dozens of guardsmen were practicing their drill movements. The precision was impressive, but something bothered him about the rigid formality of it all. In Israel, soldiers moved with purpose and adaptability. Here, everything seemed choreographed to the point of being impractical. "Quite a show you have here," David commented, gesturing toward the drilling soldiers, "though I have to wonder about the tactical applications of such elaborate movements." Captain Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight tightening around his eyes. "These are not mere movements, Colonel. They are traditions that have been perfected over centuries. Each step, each turn, has meaning and purpose." As they walked through the barracks, David observed the guards preparing for their duties. Some were cleaning their rifles with meticulous care. Others were adjusting their uniforms with almost obsessive attention to detail. The silence was broken only by the occasional bark of a sergeant major correcting a minor flaw in posture or equipment placement. "In my experience," David said. Unable to keep his thoughts to himself, soldiers perform better when they focus on combat readiness rather than looking pretty for tourists. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Several nearby guardsmen glanced in their direction, their faces carefully expressionless, but their ears clearly tuned to the conversation. Captain Whitmore stopped walking and turned to face David directly. "Colonel Roth, I understand that different armies have different approaches. However, the Queen's Guard represents more than military efficiency. We are the living embodiment of British heritage and the monarchy itself. Our traditions date back centuries and have been maintained through wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires." David felt his patience beginning to wear thin. He had fought in 3 wars, commanded special operations that saved countless lives, and earned respect through blood, sweat, and results. The idea that standing still and looking ceremonial was somehow equivalent to real military service struck him as absurd. "Heritage is fine," David replied, his voice carrying a slight edge. "But when push comes to shove, can your men fight? Can they adapt to changing situations? Or are they so locked into their routines that they become sitting ducks in real combat?" The question hit the parade ground like a thunderclap. Conversations stopped, and heads turned in their direction. Captain Whitmore's jaw clenched slightly. And for the first time since David's arrival, the British officer's composure showed signs of strain. "Perhaps," Captain Whitmore said quietly, "you would benefit from observing our changing of the guard ceremony tomorrow morning. It might give you a better understanding of what we represent." David shrugged. "Sure, I'll watch your parade, but I reserve the right to point out tactical improvements when I see them." As they continued their tours, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was surrounded by toy soldiers playing dress-up. The elaborate uniforms, the ceremonial weapons, the rigid adherence to protocol, it all seemed like a waste of military resources. In Israel, every soldier was trained to be flexible, to think independently, and to prioritize mission success over looking good. That evening, As David sat in his temporary quarters reviewing briefing materials, he made a decision. Tomorrow, during the changing of the guard ceremony, he would demonstrate to these British soldiers what real military efficiency looked like. He would show them that their precious traditions were nothing more than outdated pageantry that had no place in modern warfare. What Colonel David Roth didn't realize was that he was about to challenge something far more powerful than military protocol. He was about to confront the soul of British military tradition, and that soul had teeth. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. With hundreds of tourists already gathering outside Buckingham Palace for the famous changing of the guard ceremony, David arrived at the palace gates early, wearing his service uniform and carrying a small notebook where he planned to jot down his observations about the tactical flaws he expected to witness. Captain Whitmore met him at the designated viewing area reserved for military personnel and dignitaries. The British officer looked even more formal than usual, if such a thing were possible. David noticed several other senior British officers had joined them. Word of the Israeli colonel's comments had apparently spread through the ranks overnight. "Colonel Roth," Captain Whitmore said with exaggerated politeness, "I do hope you find today's ceremony educational." David nodded absently. His attention focused on the guardsmen who were beginning to form up in the palace courtyard. They moved with mechanical precision, each step calculated and rehearsed. To David's trained eye, they looked vulnerable and predictable, exactly the kind of targets that guerrilla fighters loved to engage. "Tell me," David said to Captain Whitmore, "what happens if someone attacks during this ceremony? Are your men prepared for that scenario?" "The Queen's Guard are highly trained soldiers, Colonel. They may wear ceremonial uniforms, but they are combat-ready at all times." David raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, they look like they're more concerned with keeping their hats straight than watching for threats." The ceremony began with the thunderous sound of drums and the melodic strains of military bands. The old guard marched out in perfect formation, their red tunics blazing in the morning sunlight, their bearskin hats creating a sea of black fur. The precision was undeniable, but David saw only wasted motion and tactical vulnerability. "Look at them," David muttered, making notes in his book. "They're completely exposed. No situational awareness. If this were a real combat situation, they'd all be dead within minutes." Captain Whitmore's face remained impassive. But David noticed the other British officers exchanging glances. Some looked offended. Others seemed curious about where this criticism was heading. The new guard began their approach, marching in lockstep with mechanical precision. Their rifles were held at identical angles, their movements synchronized to the second. To the tourists, it was a magnificent display of military pageantry. To David, it was a tactical nightmare. "This is ridiculous," David said, his voice rising slightly. "Why are they marching in such tight formation? They're presenting a perfect target for any sniper. And those rifles, are they even loaded? What's the point of carrying weapons if you're not prepared to use them?" "Colonel," Captain Whitmore said quietly, "perhaps you would benefit from a closer look at our procedures, without waiting for a response." Captain Whitmore led David through a side gate and into the palace courtyard itself. Suddenly, David found himself just meters away from the guardsmen as they performed their intricate ceremony. The sound of boots on cobblestones was deafening, the synchronized movements even more impressive up close. But David remained unimpressed. If anything, being closer to the action only reinforced his belief that this was all for show. He watched as the officers conducted their formal inspection, checking weapons and uniforms with elaborate ceremony. Every gesture was prescribed, every word predetermined. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," David said, no longer bothering to keep his voice down. "Everything is so rigid, so predictable. A real enemy would study this routine and exploit every weakness." His words carried across the courtyard, and David noticed several guardsmen glancing in his direction. Their faces remained expressionless, but he could sense their attention. Captain Whitmore looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly aware that the ceremony was being disrupted by his guest's commentary. Perhaps David continued, warming to his theme, "Your men would benefit from some real military training. In Israel, We teach our soldiers to adapt, to think independently, to break from routine when the situation demands it. He gestured at the ceremony. This is just military theater. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Several senior British officers had moved closer, their faces showing varying degrees of offense and curiosity. The ceremony continued around them. David could sense that he had crossed a line. Captain Whitmore stepped closer to David, his voice low but intense. "Colonel Roth, I must ask you to moderate your comments. This ceremony represents centuries of British military tradition." "Tradition doesn't win wars," David shot back. "Results do. And if your soldiers are more concerned with looking pretty than being effective, then you're setting them up for failure." It was then that David made his fateful decision. He had been invited to observe, but observation wasn't enough. These British soldiers needed to understand what real military efficiency looked like. They needed a demonstration that would shock them out of their complacent adherence to meaningless ritual. "You know what?" David said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Let me show you how this should be done. Let me show you what real soldiers look like when they're not playing dress-up." The ceremony ground to a halt. Hundreds of tourists pressed against the palace gates, cameras ready, expecting to witness the flawless execution of a time-honored tradition. Instead, they were about to see something unprecedented, a foreign officer challenging the very heart of British military. Protocol. David stepped forward into the formation. His practical uniform a stark contrast to the red and gold splendor surrounding him. He had no idea that he was about to learn a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The moment David stepped into the formation, the atmosphere in the palace courtyard changed dramatically. The guardsmen, who had been executing their centuries-old routine with mechanical precision, suddenly stopped. The silence was so complete that even the tourists outside, the gates seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening. Sergeant Major Harrison, a mountain of a man whose chest was decorated with ribbons from conflicts spanning 3 decades, stepped forward. His face was carved from granite, his eyes cold as winter steel. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had never, in 30 years of service, encountered such brazen disrespect for military protocol. "Sir," Sergeant Major Harrison said, his voice cutting through the morning air like a sword, "you are disrupting a ceremonial duty in the presence of Her Majesty's residence. I must ask you to step back immediately." David felt a surge of adrenaline. This was exactly the kind of confrontation he had been hoping for. Finally, someone was willing to engage with him directly instead of hiding behind polite British formality. "Sergeant Major, I'm trying to help your men understand what real military bearing looks like," David replied, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "This parade ground nonsense might impress tourists, but it has nothing to do with actual soldiering." The words hit the assembled guardsmen like physical blows. These were men who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Falklands. They had bled for their country and their regiment, and they had earned the right to wear the uniform through. Sacrifice and dedication that this foreign officer clearly didn't understand. Private Thompson, barely 20 years old but already a veteran of 2 deployments, felt his hands clench into fists. Corporal Davies, who had carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire, stared at David with barely controlled anger. These men understood that the ceremony wasn't separate from their combat duties. It was an expression of the same discipline and precision that kept them alive in battle. Colonel Captain Whitmore said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "I must insist that you return to the observation area. You are interfering with an official ceremony." But David was beyond listening to reason. The adrenaline of confrontation had taken hold, and he was determined to prove his point. He began walking among the guardsmen, pointing out what he saw as tactical errors. "Look at this formation," he said loudly, gesturing at the perfectly aligned ranks. "Bunched up like sheep waiting for slaughter. And these weapons? When was the last time any of you actually fired them in anger? Do you even remember your combat training, or has it all been replaced by this ceremonial nonsense?" That was the moment when David crossed the line from criticism into insult. The guardsmen he was addressing weren't ceremonial soldiers playing at war. They were combat veterans who had chosen to serve in one of the most elite units in the British Army. The Queen's Guard wasn't a reward for pretty parades. It was recognition of proven courage and skill. Sergeant Major Harrison stepped directly in front of David, his massive frame blocking the Israeli colonel's path. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Sir, you clearly don't understand what you're looking at. These men have earned the right to wear this uniform through blood and sacrifice. They've served in some of the most dangerous places on earth, and they've brought honor to their regiment and their country. What you're seeing isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the kind of discipline that keeps men alive when everything goes wrong." David felt a flicker of uncertainty, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Discipline is fine, Sergeant Major, but this isn't discipline. It's mindless routine. Real soldiers adapt to situations. They don't follow scripts. Is that so?" Sergeant Major Harrison said, and for the first time, there was something that might have been amusement in his voice. "Well then, Colonel, perhaps you'd like a demonstration of just how adaptable these mindless soldiers can be." Before David could respond, Sergeant Major Harrison barked a series of commands in a voice that had been trained to cut through the chaos of battle. The effect was instantaneous and stunning. The guardsmen around David didn't break formation, they transformed it. What had appeared to be rigid ceremonial positioning suddenly revealed itself as tactical deployment. The men who had seemed vulnerable and exposed were now covering each other's fields of fire with professional competence that took David's breath away. Combat spacing. Establish defensive perimeter, weapons ready. The commands came in rapid succession, and the guardsmen responded with a speed and precision that had nothing to do with parade ground drilling and everything to do with combat experience. Within seconds, David found himself in the center of a defensive formation that would have made any special forces unit proud. The men around him had maintained their ceremonial appearance, but their positioning, their alertness, and their weapon handling were pure combat professionalism. "You see," Colonel Sergeant Major Harrison said quietly, "we can do both. We can honor our traditions and maintain our combat readiness. The ceremony isn't separate from our military skills. It's an expression of them. The same discipline that makes us effective in battle makes us effective on the parade ground." For the first time since arriving in London, David felt genuinely uncertain. These men had just demonstrated something he hadn't expected: the ability to maintain ceremonial protocol while being fully prepared for combat. They hadn't abandoned their traditions to prove their military competence. They had used their traditions to demonstrate it, but David's pride was wounded. And wounded pride can make even intelligent men do foolish things. Instead of acknowledging what he had just witnessed, he decided to escalate the confrontation. "Impressive," he said, his voice carrying a sarcastic edge. "But can you maintain that readiness while dealing with real threats? Because from where I stand, you're still more concerned with keeping your uniforms clean than with actual security." It was a challenge that Sergeant Major Harrison couldn't ignore, and David was about to discover that challenging the Queen's Guard on their own ground was a mistake that would teach him more about military tradition and military reality than he had ever imagined possible. Sergeant Major Harrison's eyes narrowed as he studied the Israeli colonel standing defiantly in the center of the palace courtyard. Around them, the guardsmen maintained their positions with the kind of professional composure that comes from years of dealing with unexpected situations. The tourists beyond the gates had no idea they were witnessing something far more significant than a ceremonial changing of the guard. "Very well," Colonel Sergeant Major Harrison said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You want to see how we handle real threats while maintaining our traditions? Allow me to arrange a demonstration." Without taking his eyes off David, the sergeant major spoke quietly into his radio. Within minutes, the courtyard was sealed off from public view and additional personnel began arriving. David noticed they weren't all guardsmen. Some wore the insignia of other elite British units, and their presence suggested that word of this confrontation had reached the highest levels of military command. "What exactly do you have in mind?" David asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "A simple exercise," Sergeant Major Harrison replied. "You claim our adherence to protocol makes us vulnerable and predictable. You suggest that our traditions compromise our effectiveness. Very well, prove it. Captain Whitmore stepped forward, his face pale. Sergeant Major, perhaps we should consider? No, sir, Harrison interrupted with respectful firmness. The colonel has made his position clear. He believes our way of doing things is inferior to his. I think it's time we settled this question definitively. David felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he had pushed things beyond the point of polite military exchange. This was no longer about cultural differences or tactical philosophy. This had become a direct challenge to the competence, in honor of some of Britain's most elite soldiers. The rules are simple. Sergeant Major Harrison explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. You will attempt to disrupt our security protocols using any methods you choose. You have 30 minutes to demonstrate that our adherence to tradition makes us vulnerable to attack. If you succeed in compromising our defensive posture or breaching our security perimeter, then perhaps there's merit to your criticism. And if I fail? David asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer, then you acknowledge that you've misjudged what you've seen here today, and you offer a public apology to these men for questioning their professionalism. The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down on a medieval battlefield. David looked around at the faces surrounding him, some curious, some hostile, all professional. These were men who had proven themselves in combat, and they were giving him a chance to prove his theories under controlled conditions. David's tactical mind began working immediately. He had extensive experience in urban warfare and special operations. He understood how to exploit predictable routines and rigid protocols. If these guardsmen were as locked into their ceremonial patterns as he believed, then disrupting their operations should be relatively straightforward. Accepted, David said, his confidence returning. But I want it understood that this is a training exercise. No one gets hurt, of course. Sergeant Major Harrison agreed. Though I should warn you, these men don't like to lose. And they've had considerable experience dealing with individuals who try to disrupt their duties. The next few minutes were spent establishing ground rules and safety protocols. David would be given freedom to move around the palace grounds and attempt to compromise the guard's security using any non-violent methods he could devise. The guardsmen would continue their duties as normal, responding to his actions as they would to any genuine threat. As David prepared for the challenge, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before a difficult mission. This was his element, unconventional warfare, thinking outside established patterns, using creativity and adaptability to overcome superior numbers and prepared positions. He began by studying the guard positions, noting their patrol patterns and communication procedures. The ceremonial elements were still in place, but David could see that underlying military discipline was now fully engaged. The guardsmen moved with purposeful alertness, their ceremonial roles seamlessly integrated with genuine security functions. David's first approach was subtle. He attempted to identify weak points in their perimeter by posing as a lost diplomatic visitor. The response was immediate and professional. Within seconds, he found himself courteously but firmly escorted back to authorized areas by guardsmen who never broke character but never lost control of the situation. His second attempt was more aggressive. Using his knowledge of small unit tactics, David tried to create a distraction on one side of the courtyard while attempting to penetrate the security perimeter from another direction. The result was humbling. The guardsmen adapted to his misdirection with practiced ease, maintaining their ceremonial positions while effectively countering his tactical maneuvers. With each failed attempt, David's respect for these soldiers grew. They weren't just following scripts, they were demonstrating a level of integrated professionalism that combined traditional military skills with genuine tactical adaptability. The ceremony continued around his disruption attempts, but it was clear that the guardsmen were fully capable of maintaining security while executing their traditional duties as the 30-minute limit approached. David found himself in the uncomfortable position of having comprehensively failed to prove his point. Worse, his failure had been observed by an audience of British military professionals who had given him every opportunity to succeed. The final moments of the challenge would teach David a lesson about military tradition that would fundamentally change his understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. But first, he had to face the consequences of his arrogance and acknowledge that he had been wrong about almost everything he had assumed about the Queen's Guard. As the 30 minutes drew to a close, David found himself standing in the center of the palace courtyard, breathing heavily and feeling thoroughly outmaneuvered. Every tactical approach he had attempted had been countered with professional competence that bordered on artistry. The guardsmen had never broken their ceremonial posture, never abandoned their traditional protocols, and yet they had anticipated and neutralized every one of his moves with the efficiency of a well-oiled military machine. Sergeant Major Harrison approached him with measured steps, his expression unreadable. Around them, the other guardsmen maintained their positions with the same disciplined alertness they had shown throughout the exercise. "Time," Colonel Harrison announced. "I believe that concludes our demonstration." David nodded, unable to find words for what he was feeling. Humility was not an emotion he was accustomed to, especially in military matters. He had built his career on tactical innovation and adaptive thinking. Yet these men had systematically outhought him while never abandoning the very traditions he had criticized. "I don't understand," David finally said, his voice quiet enough that only Harrison could hear. "How did you do that? How did you maintain all the ceremony while still being so tactically effective?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Sergeant Major Harrison's expression softened slightly. "That's the question you should have asked from the beginning, Colonel. You saw tradition and efficiency as opposing forces. But that's not how we see it at all." Captain Whitmore joined them, his earlier tension replaced by something that might have been sympathy. "Colonel Roth, may I ask about your military background? What units did you serve with? Paratroopers, special forces, urban warfare specialists?" David replied. Wondering where this was leading? "Combat units," Whitmore observed. "Units focused on mission accomplishment under extreme conditions. Excellent units, from what I understand. But tell me, did those units have any traditions? Any ceremonies or protocols that weren't directly related to combat effectiveness?" David thought about it. "Well, yes. Unit ceremonies, memorial services, formal inspections. But those were different. They were about unit cohesion and morale." "Exactly," Sergeant Major Harrison said, and there was approval in his voice. "You understand the connection between tradition and military effectiveness in your own units. You just couldn't see it in ours." What followed was a conversation that would reshape David's understanding of military culture. The guardsmen around them, still maintaining their ceremonial positions, began to share their own stories. Private Thompson spoke about how the discipline required for ceremonial duties had saved his life. During a firefight in Afghanistan, the same attention to detail that kept his uniform immaculate had kept his weapon clean and functional when it mattered most. "Corporal," Davies explained how the trust required for precision drill movements translated directly into the kind of teamwork that allowed soldiers to rely on each other in combat. The same coordination that made the changing of the guard look effortless made his squad effective in urban warfare environments, you see, Captain Whitmore explained. "The ceremony isn't separate from our military effectiveness. It's an expression of it. The discipline, the attention to detail, the coordination, the trust in your fellow soldiers, all of these things that make us effective on the parade ground make us effective on the battlefield." David began to understand something he had missed entirely. These men weren't choosing between tradition and effectiveness. They were using tradition to develop and maintain the qualities that made them effective. The ceremony wasn't a distraction from military training. It was military training of the highest order, but surely, David said, still struggling with the concept, there must be some conflict between maintaining traditions and adapting to modern threats. "Sergeant Major." Harrison smiled, the first genuine smile David had seen from him. "Colonel, these traditions have survived centuries of warfare precisely because they develop the qualities that make good soldiers. Discipline, attention to detail, trust in your comrades, pride in your unit. These things don't become obsolete just because technology changes." As if to prove the point, Harrison signaled to his men, and they executed a complex maneuver that transitioned seamlessly from ceremonial formation to tactical positioning. It was breathtaking to watch. The same precision that made their parade ground movements impressive made their tactical movements devastatingly effective. The tourists see the ceremony, Harrison explained. The enemy sees the same discipline and coordination that makes us dangerous opponents. We're not hiding our military capabilities behind tradition, we're demonstrating them through tradition. David felt something fundamental shift in his understanding. He had spent his career believing that efficiency required abandoning anything that wasn't directly functional. But these men had shown him that some traditions were functional precisely because they developed and maintained the human qualities that no amount of technology could replace. "I owe you an apology," David said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "All of you. I came here thinking I understood military effectiveness, but I was only seeing part of the picture." The guardsmen around him maintained their professional demeanor, but David could sense their approval. These were men who understood that admitting error took as much courage as facing enemy fire. But David's education wasn't complete yet. Sergeant Major Harrison had one more lesson to teach him, and it would be the most important one of all. The understanding as David stood in the palace courtyard, processing everything he had learned. "Sergeant Major," Harrison approached him with something unexpected, a cup of tea and a knowing smile. "There's one more thing you need to understand," Colonel Harrison said, gesturing for David to join him on a bench overlooking the parade ground. "You came here thinking that tradition and effectiveness were enemies. But you missed the most important point of all." David accepted the tea gratefully, his mind still reeling from the demonstration he had witnessed. "What did I miss?" "You assumed that because something looks ceremonial, it must be purely symbolic. But what if I told you that every movement, every gesture, every protocol you've seen today has been tested and refined through centuries of actual combat?" Harrison stood and began walking David through the ceremony that had resumed around them. But now, instead of seeing rigid formality, David began to understand the tactical intelligence embedded in every tradition. "Watch how they move," Harrison explained. "Those aren't arbitrary steps. They're movement patterns that maintain maximum situational awareness while presenting a unified front. The spacing between men isn't for show, it's calculated to provide optimal fields of fire while preventing a single attack from taking out multiple soldiers." David watched with new eyes as the guardsmen executed their duties. What had seemed like meaningless pageantry now revealed itself as a complex tactical system disguised as ceremony. "Even the uniforms serve multiple purposes," Harrison continued. "The bright colors aren't just for tourists, they identify friend from foe instantly in chaotic situations. The distinctive silhouette makes it impossible for enemies to blend in with our forces. And the formal bearing communicates authority and control, which can diffuse tense situations without violence." As the lesson continued, David realized he had made the classic mistake of assuming that anything unfamiliar must be inferior. He had brought his own cultural biases about military effectiveness and dismissed anything that didn't match his preconceptions. "In Israel," David said thoughtfully, "we pride ourselves on adapting quickly, on discarding anything that doesn't contribute to mission success. But we have our own traditions, unit histories, memorial ceremonies, certain protocols that aren't strictly necessary, but that bind us together as soldiers." "Exactly," Harrison nodded. "Every military culture develops traditions that serve essential functions. The mistake is thinking that efficiency means abandoning everything that isn't obviously practical. Sometimes the most practical things are the ones that develop character, discipline, and unit cohesion." As the afternoon wore on, David found himself engaged in conversations with guardsmen from different backgrounds and experiences. He learned that many of them had chosen to serve with the Queen's Guard precisely because it demanded the highest standards of military professionalism. Far from being a ceremonial posting for soldiers who couldn't handle combat duties, it was a recognition of proven excellence. Private Williams, who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, explained how the discipline required for ceremonial duties had actually made him a better soldier in combat. "When you can stand perfectly still for 2 hours while tourists take photos and children try to make you laugh, You develop the kind of mental discipline that serves you well when things get difficult. Corporal Martinez, veteran of operations in Sierra Leone, described how the precision required for drill movements translated into the kind of coordination that saved lives during complex military operations. When you can move as one unit without thinking about it, when you trust your fellow soldiers completely, that's when you become truly effective. As evening approached, David found himself participating in the guardsmen's off-duty activities. He learned about their combat training, their physical fitness standards, their ongoing education programs. These weren't ceremonial soldiers playing at being warriors. They were warriors who had learned to express their professionalism through ceremony. "I need to ask you something," David said to Sergeant Major Harrison as they watched the final ceremony of the day. "Why didn't you just explain all this to me from the beginning? Why let me make such a fool of myself?" Harrison chuckled, the sound rich with years of experience dealing with overconfident officers. "Would you have listened? You came here convinced that you already understood what you were seeing. Sometimes people have to discover the truth for themselves before they can accept it." David nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Harrison's approach. He thought about his own soldiers back in Israel, and how often he had seen young officers make similar mistakes, assuming that their way was the only effective way, dismissing anything unfamiliar as inferior. "What happens now?" David asked. "I came here as a liaison officer, but I feel like I need to start over." "Now," Harrison said, "you do what good officers do when they realize they've made an error. You learn from it, and you use that knowledge to become better at your job." Over the following days, David threw himself into understanding British military tradition with the same intensity he had once brought to criticizing it. He studied the history behind the ceremonies, the tactical reasoning behind the protocols, the human psychology that made tradition an effective tool for building military excellence. He also began to examine his own military culture with new eyes, recognizing traditions he had taken for granted and understanding how they contributed to the effectiveness of Israeli forces. The informal camaraderie, the emphasis on innovation, the focus on mission accomplishment, these weren't just cultural quirks. They were carefully maintained traditions that served essential military functions. When David finally returned to Israel, he brought with him more than just tactical knowledge about urban warfare. He brought a deeper understanding of how military excellence could be achieved through different paths, and how tradition and innovation could work together, rather than against each other. The story of the Israeli commander who challenged the Queen's Guard became something of a legend in military circles, not as a tale of cultural conflict, but as an example of how professional soldiers from different backgrounds could learn from each other. David often told the story to his own officers, emphasizing the importance of humility and the danger of assuming that unfamiliar approaches were necessarily inferior approaches. Years later, when asked about his experience with the British Royal Guard, David would smile and say, "They taught me that the best soldiers aren't necessarily the ones who break with tradition. Sometimes they're the ones who understand it so deeply that they can honor it while still being devastatingly effective." The lesson extended far beyond military protocol. David learned that true strength often comes not from abandoning the past, but from understanding how the wisdom of previous generations can be applied to present challenges. The Queen's Guard had shown him that discipline and flexibility weren't opposing forces, they were complementary aspects of military excellence. In his final report to his superiors, David wrote, "The British Royal Guard represents something. I initially failed to understand the integration of tradition with tactical excellence. These soldiers have not chosen ceremony over combat effectiveness. They have found a way to make ceremony serve combat effectiveness. Their adherence to protocol doesn't make them rigid. It makes them predictably excellent." The transformation, in David's perspective, was complete. But perhaps more importantly, it was lasting. He had learned that military wisdom comes in many forms, and that dismissing unfamiliar approaches without understanding them was a form of intellectual arrogance that could blind even experienced officers to valuable lessons. The Guardsmen, for their part, had demonstrated something equally important, that confidence in your own methods doesn't require dismissing or demeaning other approaches. They had been secure enough in their own traditions to allow David to challenge them, and professional enough to teach rather than simply punish when he overstepped. The incident became a case study in military leadership schools, illustrating how cultural exchanges between allied forces could lead to mutual understanding and improved effectiveness. It showed that the best military traditions weren't brittle customs that couldn't withstand scrutiny, but robust systems that became stronger when tested and examined. As David's plane lifted off from London's Heathrow Airport, he looked down at the city below and reflected on how much his perspective had changed. He had arrived as a critic and was leaving as a student. The Queen's Guard had given him something more valuable than tactical knowledge. They had given him humility, and the understanding that true military excellence could take many forms. The memory of that morning in the palace courtyard would stay with David for the rest of his career. Whenever he encountered military practices that seemed strange or inefficient, he would remember Sergeant Major Harrison's patient explanation and his own mistaken assumptions. He would ask questions instead of making judgments, and he would look for the wisdom that might be hidden within unfamiliar traditions. In the end, the Israeli commander who had tried to assert control over the royal guard learned the most important lesson of all, that the strongest leaders are those who never stop learning, and that true military excellence requires both the courage to challenge assumptions and the wisdom to recognize when those assumptions are wrong